What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. What's that you say? You want to know if there's a comic where the Incredible Hulk rips Wolverine in half? Why, yes. Yes, there is. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are covering Ultimate Wolverine vs. Hulk. Now, a lot of you guys may have noticed that I've never really delved into the Ultimate Universe because I never really had a reason to. To be honest, my emphasis was always on the main Marvel timeline because there was always stuff to talk about, always things to go over. But the more I thought about it, and you guys loving Incredible Hulk stuff, the more I thought, well, let's branch into the Ultimate Universe because the Ultimate Universe actually had some really cool things. So here was the deal. When it came to the main Marvel universe versus the Ultimate Universe, the main Marvel universe was like a mall. Like you go to the mall and you've got a million stores. You got Foot Locker, you got the Finish Line, you got Williams-Sonoma, you have all kinds of stores all over the place. The Ultimate Universe was the corner store. You go in there and they've got one, machine that has drinks, and they've got like 3 loaves of bread. They're only open on weekdays and they're open for like 5 hours and they're closed on weekends. I mean, it was a very small, very niche market for comic books, but it was designed to be that way. And the reason behind this was because when the Ultimate Universe was launched in 2000, it was this idea that the main Marvel universe had just become too huge and too convoluted. You had, I think up until that point, like 3 volumes of just amazing Spider-Man, to say nothing of the ancillary titles like Sensational Spider-Man and Web of Spider-Man and all that kind of good stuff. You had all these different things that were going on. You had Avengers, you had West Coast Avengers, you had Great Lakes Avengers, you had X-Men Volume 2, New X-Men, Uncanny X-Men, we have Extraordinary X-Men, All New X-Men now. You had all these different types of titles, and it was really confusing for a lot of different people. And so while the Ultimate Universe was not a reboot, it was effectively a reimagining, and it was designed to be much darker and much grittier as opposed to really happy and really fun. So for those of you guys who are watching movies in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, this is essentially a scenario where the movies in the MCU are basically deriving a lot of their content from the Ultimate Universe because of its nature. Case in point, Wolverine. So this story, as it was written by Damon Lindelof, I think, initially picks up with Wolverine himself, and it's really just a scenario where he's been torn in half by the Incredible Hulk. Now, I also think we need to do a little bit of exposition here regarding these 2 characters because, of course, they are the main focus, but we learn about other characters like She-Hulk, but we really get our origin in this story. So the way it worked with Wolverine and really just the overall mutant aspect of the Ultimate Universe was that Nick Fury was basically the first super soldier. It was not Captain America, it was not Steve Rogers, it was Nick Fury. Because Nick Fury successfully was able to consume the super soldier serum and become the greatest soldier, Steve Rogers was the next step. The problem with this was that after the super soldier serum was made, everybody was vying for it. This is where Wolverine came into play. Canada was looking to create their own super soldier, and they basically used Logan as a way to do this, but in the process of giving him the super soldier serum, they discovered the gene for mutants, that when these genes are activated, that they'll grant people superpowers, and so Wolverine is effectively the origin of mutants. Now, in terms of like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, if Marvel ever got the rights back to the X-Men, this is probably how they would do it. They would start with Wolverine, and they would have him experimented on. Whoever it was who was studying him would say, hey, this guy has like these weird genes, let's examine them more. Thus, the origin of mutants is born. That's the most logical way to bring mutants into the Marvel Cinematic Universe with regards to the X-Men and so on. The Incredible Hulk was actually a little bit different. Because of the fact that the super soldier serum was this thing that everybody was going for, it was a scenario where Banner was effectively trying to recreate the super soldier serum. The problem with this was that when he tried to make the serum and experimented on himself, it resulted in the Incredible Hulk. Now, much like the main Marvel universe, Banner, whenever he's the Hulk, rampages around and tears stuff up. The difference is that with this particular story, he actually killed, or at least his actions in New York, resulted in the deaths of around 800 people. And so this has effectively made the Incredible Hulk the world's most wanted man. The caveat to this is that Nick Fury is basically doing all this underground. He doesn't want anybody to know about it because remember, when it comes to the Ultimate Universe, S.H.I.E.L.D. operates out of the Triskelion, or the current base of operations for the Ultimates in all new, all different Marvel. That's where Marvel got that from. They basically took the Triskelion, the base of operations from the Ultimate Universe, rolled it over into all new, all different Marvel, reimagined the Ultimates as, Adam Brashear and Carol Danvers and so on and so forth, and then had them operate out of the Triskelion. That's where all that stuff comes from. For those of you guys who are curious, and when I said Ultimates, you're like, oh, yeah, cool, that kind of thing. But the idea here is that Wolverine almost immediately picks up on this because remember, at this point in his character's history, he has adamantium, he has a healing factor, he is the Wolverine that we come to know and love from the main main Marvel universe. Now, when he's brought here by Nick Fury, the first thing he picks up on is that they're not in the Triskelion, which means that Nick Fury is playing this one pretty close to the vest, but there's also a lot of cloak and dagger here. He's playing in the shadows quite a bit in the sense that he doesn't want anybody else to know about it. Now, the cool thing about this story, and this may get a little weird as we go on, so I'm going to try to make sense of it as best I can, but this is very much a Vantage Point type story. And what I mean is that for those of you guys who remember the movie, Vantage Point was a film where it was a singular event, but it was given to us from different people's perspectives, from a Secret Service agent, from the press, from a regular bystander who was just watching the events unfold with a camcorder. This story is very similar in the sense that as we progress through it, we get things from different people's perspectives, all of which culminate in this sort of finale, this sort of major battle. But the idea here is that Logan basically says, okay, look, if we're gonna have this conversation, I need to be dealt in. I need to know all the cards that are on the table right now. Now, of course, Nick Fury doesn't initially, or at least pretends like he doesn't know what Wolverine's talking about. He plays it very coy here, and Wolverine says basically, there's two people standing behind that mirror back there, or standing behind that painting. And we actually learn that it's Betty Ross and it is Jennifer Walters. Now, Jennifer Walters is effectively a public relations person in the Ultimate Universe. She's not really a traditional lawyer as we saw her in the main Marvel Universe, but Betty Ross is still very much a scientist. She's still very much a doctor. Now, this makes sense just because of the fact that Betty Ross and Bruce Banner are kind of two sides of the same coin. One goes with the other. You really don't have scenarios where there's Betty Ross and Bruce Banner has nothing to do with her. It's almost always a scenario where the two of them are almost one and the same, that they basically share the same thing. And so because of this, when they're introduced to Wolverine, when he's told that Jennifer Walters is running the PR side, trying to keep everything hush-hush regarding S.H.I.E.L.D.'s involvement with taking out Banner, and that Betty Ross is the one that's most familiar with what it is that happened to Banner, he also says, look, we had the other half, the other brains of our operation, which of course turned out to be Banner, but we also learned that after he had taken off, after the event in New York that had resulted in this massive explosion, that he had basically started traversing the countryside, jumping from one place to the next, really just kind of being a nomad, but he had also eaten people along the way. Now, the way that Nick Fury gives this to us is he basically says that there was this massive supposed bombing in Paris, which was really just the Incredible Hulk lashing out. There were a bunch of cattle that were killed along with people who were cannibalized. In India, there was this massive earthquake. And so it's really just Nick Fury saying, hey, as far as the world's concerned, these are legitimate things, that there was a bombing in Paris, that a bunch of these cattle, were destroyed by what's believed to be a pack of wolves, that in India, there was an actual earthquake. But for Nick Fury and his S.H.I.E.L.D. resources, he basically says, this is Banner. This is the Incredible Hulk rampaging across the world effectively. Now, the funny thing about this is that in the Ultimate Universe, Wolverine is very cutthroat. Well, not really cutthroat. I'd say he's very, he's not really callous so much as he doesn't really care. This is the best way to put it. This is given to us when Jennifer Walters sits down with Logan, with Wolverine, and says, hey, look, when it comes down to it, despite the fact that the Incredible Hulk is violent, Bruce Banner is a good guy. If you're gonna kill him, try to make it quick. And so again, Wolverine's just kind of like, whatever, he'll kill him in the best way that he wants to, is really the kind of scenario that we're facing here. But after traveling to Tibet, which is the last known location of Bruce Banner, we actually find in the smaller regions around this main, really castle, so to speak, that there are no women present there. And the reason why there's no women present there is that once Wolverine makes his location or makes his way to where Bruce Banner is supposed to be, he basically finds that Banner's in this temple with like women surrounding him. Now, in truth, this is actually paying homage to Future Imperfect, because Future Imperfect was such a landmark story in the Incredible Hulk's mythos. But in that story, it basically dealt with the future where the Incredible Hulk had absorbed a lot of nuclear radiation or atomic radiation after the world had been laid waste to by nuclear war, leaving only a handful of humans alive. But when we first saw Maestro Hulk, he was basically in a landscape where he was surrounded by women. And so this is more or less paying homage to this. But from here, we transition away from Logan and we actually pick up with Banner's perspective. Now, again, this essentially just immediately picks up after his transformation into the Hulk. And it basically shows us, at least a little bit, this major conflict that happened in New York. Now, there is a story that actually deals directly with Bruce Banner becoming the Incredible Hulk and the whole origin behind that, which of course we'll cover probably next week sometime, to be honest with you guys. But because of the fact that this version of the Incredible Hulk is much similar to the one that we know, in the sense that he tries to remain isolated, tries to be left alone, Banner's also trying to regain control. And so what he does is he actually goes to Paris and he basically speaks with a psychiatrist. And so what we're going to find in this little section here is this is really just us being given what Banner was doing when these supposed incidents of Paris and India and those cattle that were destroyed is effectively us being shown what Banner was doing when he did these things. And so in this instance, when it was the supposed bombing in Paris, that it turned out Banner was actually talking to a psychiatrist. The problem with this was the psychiatrist woman was actually kind of an ass, like, to be honest. She kept pushing him and pushing him and pushing him and kept referring to him as David. Now, as we know, Hulk does not like to be referred to as Banner or David. Hulk likes to be be referred to as Hulk. And so because of the fact that this psychiatrist makes reference to the idea that maybe Bruce Banner's impotent, that maybe Betty Ross had basically left him because he was an impotent man, because he was unable to perform to the standards that Betty Ross was expecting, that ultimately she bailed out on him, effectively calling him a wimp. Because of this, Banner basically turns into the Hulk and just lays waste to the entire area. So again, this is us seeing what this led to with regards to him tearing up Paris. Now from here, we actually end up jumping to another remote location, effectively in Ireland, where all these cattle were destroyed. And what happens is Banner's again just trying to have this conversation with different people, moving from one place to the next, trying to stay low key. But because of the fact that he starts talking about how he enjoys tofu, they begin making fun of him, basically saying he's not a man. And so because of this, he lashes out, he eats the guys, and then he eats a whole bunch of the cattle. And so again, this is really him just kind of losing his mind. Now, the funny thing about this, and this is something I'd like you guys to keep in mind here, is that there comes a point where he actually calls Betty Ross. Now, he routinely does this. He's done this a few times, but every time he called her, he always hung up because for whatever reason, he never really could muster the courage to say anything to her. But when he calls her this time, there's a man on the other line. And so this is why he had freaked out in India, and this is why there was the supposed earthquake, because he effectively lost his mind when he learned that Betty Ross had moved on and was with another man. And so because of this, he actually travels to Tibet to meet with this man, this called the Panchen Lama, I think is how you pronounce it. And the Panchen Lama is kind of like second to the Dalai Lama, which is actually what we learn here. The Panchen Lama is essentially a kid, but as this child begins conversing with Bruce Banner, we learn that the Panchen Lama and the Dalai Lama go hand in hand, in the sense that because reincarnation is a huge part of the Tibetan and Buddhist belief system, that the idea is that the Panchen Lama is really more of a spiritual entity, and that when the host body dies, it's reincarnated in another body. The role of the Dalai Lama is to find the Panchen Lama. It's the other way around at the same time, that when the Dalai Lama dies, that the Dalai Lama is reborn into a new body, and it's the job of the Panchen Lama to find the Dalai Lama. And so again, it's one of these really crazy situations. But one of the funny things about this is that this kid, as he's talking to Bruce Banner, initially brings up the idea of a chicken and the egg, where he talks about the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama finding one another. It's really this, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Did the Dalai Lama find the Panchen Lama, or was it the other way around? Because of this, initially seems like it's out of left field. It seems like it's almost totally irrelevant. The child also starts asking Bruce Banner about the idea of why he's here, why it was that he came here. Banner says that basically he just wants to find a way to not be angry. He wants to be able to find some measure of inner peace. But what's funny is the kid says, well, you talk about the Incredible Hulk like you and the Hulk are not the same person. But Banner says, well, we're not. We're two distinctly different individuals. Now, we know they are. They're two halves of the same coin. Banner and the Hulk were always designed to be a juxtaposition of the comparison between Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But this kid asks a really cool and important question. He says, well, think about it this way. What if it's not you turning into the Incredible Hulk? What if it's the Incredible Hulk turning into you? And so I was like, well, that's mind-blowing when I thought about it, because you got to think, the Hulk hates Banner. And so if what it seems like from Banner's perspective is that he's turning into the Hulk and losing control, then if the Hulk's always angry, it's because the Hulk is being forced back into the form of Banner, which the Hulk considers to be weak. And so it's like the Hulk's being made to be a weak person. And so it's really cool because it goes back and forth both ways. It's one of these really mind-bending questions where it says, well, which of these statements is true? Bruce Banner is the Hulk, or the Hulk is Bruce Banner? It's like one of those weird things, the following statement is true, the previous statement is false. It's a contradiction. Which one is true? Which one is false? So it's one of these really, really wild, mind-bending things. And I love that about this whole situation. But what this does is this little section of the story basically concludes with Wolverine meeting the Incredible Hulk and the Hulk offering him hot chocolate. Now, this is where the story, at least temporarily, begins to go off the rails. And the reason why I say that is because it starts bouncing back and forth between the past and the present to a degree, in the sense of catching up with strange things. And so what we're gonna do with this particular thing is we're actually gonna go in reverse of the way the comic was done, because with this particular comic, what Damon did is he basically took things backwards. He basically picked up with the previous events of Wolverine meeting the Incredible Hulk at the end of the comic, and then started moving forward from, I guess, in reverse, if that makes any sense. It's one of those weird things. But the idea here is that when Banner first shows up, when he first encounters the Incredible Hulk actually isn't inherently angry here. He's not inherently lashing out. Instead, Wolverine actually has to goad him into conflict. Now, this is kind of a big deal, because in the eyes of Wolverine, he doesn't just arbitrarily attack people, or at least it seems like he doesn't arbitrarily attack people without getting some measure of enjoyment out of it. That's one of the things that I liked about Wolverine in the Ultimate Universe, is he was very similar to like the Predator, from the Xenomorph universe, in the sense that the Predators fight for sport, or they hunt for sport, but they also want to challenge. They view honorable combat as something to aspire to. Wolverine is similar in this capacity, in the sense that if he were to kill the Incredible Hulk without the Incredible Incredible Hulk fighting, they would take away from the hunt. You know, it would have been almost a pointless adventure. But if he can goad the Incredible Hulk into getting angry, then it'll make it worth his while. And so initially he tries everything he can to piss the Hulk off. I mean, he keeps trying and trying and trying. You know, he starts talking about how the Hulk is a wimp. He starts talking about how the Hulk has basically moved away and started becoming a sissy, you know, that kind of thing. But that's not what makes Hulk angry. Instead, what he does, and this is one of the most boneheaded things I've ever heard of a person doing in comic books. Wolverine says, hey, look, man, before I leave, I got a question. Since you don't really care about Betty Ross anymore, since you're so heartbroken about her leaving you and all you want to do is just be left alone, then do you care if I knock boots? If I take her out to dinner, we do some dancing, and I take her back to my place? When Wolverine says this, the Hulk freaks, like he loses his mind and immediately begins smashing into Wolverine. This is kind of funny because the Hulk had kind of achieved this inner peace. You know, he'd achieved this enlightenment, but Wolverine was able to bring it all crashing down by poking fun or talking about the idea of getting with Betty Ross. Now, this is really, again, just the Ultimate Universe harkening back to the history of Bruce Banner in the mainline Marvel Comics and saying that Betty Ross was always his soft spot. That's where his soft targets were. Betty Ross, Amadeus Cho recently, or at least before Secret Wars, Rick Jones, these were his soft targets. If you hit him in any one of these, it would set him off. I mean, he would absolutely lose his mind. The problem with this is that when the Incredible Hulk freaks out, when the Incredible Hulk rips Wolverine in half and threatens to eat parts of his body, that in the midst of this, you know, we suddenly are met with the arrival of She-Hulk. Now, this is when we start to get her part of the story. And what we learn is that behind the scenes, when it came to She-Hulk, she was effectively trying to figure things out. She was trying to figure out what direction she was going to go in. Betty Ross, in a lot of different ways, still had some measure of affection for Bruce Banner. It was really more of the idea that he was kind of friend-zoned, but at the same time, because of the fact that she had spent so much of her time in love with him, or at least very hot and heavy in terms of their physical relationship, she couldn't help but develop some measure of a physical attraction. The problem with this was that at the same time, she also aspired to achieve greater heights, if that makes any sense. And the reason why I say this is because when Wolverine, you know, of course, picks up on the fact that both she and Jen Walters are standing behind this painting in his initial encounter with Nick Fury, we jumped forward to Betty Ross basically traveling to meet Steve Rogers and Tony Stark. Now, when she gets there and starts talking to them, this is again another example of how different things are from the mainline Marvel Universe in the sense that Steve Rogers is very, 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 very serious here. He does not really joke around. He doesn't have a good time, doesn't really have fun in the traditional sense. You know, he's really the super serious guy. The reason why I say this is something to note is because when you look at Marvel Comics in the mainline universe and you break away from events and you start looking at stories that focus on behind the scenes, Steve Rogers knows how to let his hair down, so to speak. He knows how to have a good time, how to have fun. It's not really like that here. More so than that, when Betty basically makes the case and says, hey, look, why are you guys trying to kill Bruce Banner? You know, why don't you guys try to find some way to bring him in, some way to keep him safe? And Tony Stark responds by saying, because you don't understand. You don't know what it's like to have extreme power. You don't know what it's like to have this measure of power. You constantly have to stay in control. You constantly have to stay in check. Not only that, being a superhero is as much public relations as it is actually saving people. And so because of that, you know, he says, until you have power like this, you have no clue what you're talking about. So just leave this to the professionals, is basically what he says. And so because of this, she's kind of left to go out and to do her own thing. Now, following this, we basically pick up with Jennifer Walters. Now, Jennifer Walters is kind of experimenting on this idea of trying to perfect the super soldier serum. Now, she had previously talked to Betty about this. You know, she had told Betty, hey, look, I want to take some of this stuff off reservation. I want to see if I can't perfect this super soldier serum and basically create an Incredible Hulk or give someone the powers of the Hulk without the rage that goes along with it. Because remember, in this Ultimate Universe, we never had the whole idea of Bruce Banner more or less developing multiple personalities, allowing his rage to come out because of his abusive father. Instead, this is just part of who he is. And so because of this, when Betty Ross first comes into Jennifer Walters' experiment, she was initially kind of blown away, like, why would you do this? Like, literally, this will land you in jail. But then suddenly we learn that Jennifer Walters was actually able to perfect this experiment. She was able to make it work the way that she needed to. She was able to make it function correctly. And so because of this thing is basically like a giant rat, but it has the strength of the Incredible Hulk without any of the rage of the Incredible Hulk. Now from here, we start getting into the territory of Betty Ross operating behind the scenes and actually being pretty dangerous. What she does is she goes to Nick Fury and she says, Jennifer Walters is a traitor. And Nick Fury says, why? What evidence do you have to indicate this? And she says, well, from my information, what I've been able to find, she's meeting with a Chinese contact and she's perfected created the super soldier serum that turned Bruce Banner into the Incredible Hulk. Because of this, she's going to sell the super soldier serum to the Chinese. Now, the reason why this is huge is because, again, the super soldier serum is the equivalent of the space race. I mean, it is everybody trying to find a perfected version of the super soldier serum so they can all have their own versions of Nick Fury. Not only that, imagine if any country out there basically had its own Incredible Hulk that followed orders without question. They'd be able to take out entire armies of people with the greatest of ease. It would literally catapult a third world nation to a first world nation overnight, just in terms of military might. Not to mention, Jennifer Walters would be able to bring in a ton of money for herself. And so because of this, what Betty basically says is, hey, look, what I think you should do is you should authorize her to take this serum off reservation to do what she wants to do with it. And then we follow her and we arrest her alongside her Chinese contact. And so Nick Fury says, okay, give her what she's asking for. Now, I want you to keep that phrase in the back of your mind. And the reason why is because the next morning, we basically pick up with Betty Ross calling into S.H.I.E.L.D. and saying, I need a jet here in 15 minutes and I need it to take me to an undisclosed location. Now, when S.H.I.E.L.D. initially says, well, we need confirmation by Nick Fury, what she does is she actually plays a recorder from her conversation with Nick Fury where he says, give her what she's asking for. Now, this is cool because it gives us a version of Betty Ross that we'd never really seen before. In truth, when it came to Betty Ross being manipulative, being dubious, being a pretty dark character, that didn't come along until Fall of Hulks and World War Hulks when she became Red She-Hulk. Because of that, it's a total change for her character to see her so dark and manipulative in this story. But the idea is that it works. Now, what happens is, of course, the most logical scenario here, and the fact that Nick Fury is essentially following Jennifer Walters, tracking her to her location only to find out that she was actually selling a print of Star Trek and that he'd been tricked by Betty Ross. And so once he tries to get her attention, Betty Ross effectively injects herself with this perfected version of the super soldier serum and becomes She-Hulk. And so this is really cool because then she dives into the conflict in the midst of the Incredible Hulk and Wolverine, which brings us up to this moment right here. Now, with regards to Bruce Banner witnessing that Betty Ross had made herself She-Hulk, he becomes so emotional. And the reason why is because Hulk considers himself an abomination and he considers himself to be a horrible thing. And so because of this, to see Betty Ross taking on She-Hulk makes her a mirror of how Hulk sees himself. And so he sees her becoming an abomination, a gross representation of what she used to be. And so this is really kind of a cool, a really crazy metaphysical thing. Now from here, things go batshit crazy, so we're gonna kind of ignore a lot of this, but it's really like Wolverine talking to a spirit animal, which is a panda bear. This is insane. I mean, I don't know. I don't know. I kind of feel like it'd be funny to cover, but I think it's weird because he literally gets, what, let's just go ahead and cover it. So he's talking with a spirit animal and this panda bear, he's kind of fighting with it. It's one of these weird, crazy things, but it's really the spirit animal saying, hey, look, you're going to get your head cut off, and again, this is kind of some crazy stuff, but the fact remains that we essentially just pick up with Wolverine almost immediately after he comes to from this dream that he's been having, and his head has actually been cut off by Nick Fury. Now, the conversation between the two is not of the utmost importance, but it is still relatively important because there are some things that go on here that will become prevalent later on. But Nick Fury actually shines some light on Wolverine in terms of how his power works in the Ultimate Universe, because we would take what we consider to be the Xavier protocols as an absolute truth on how to kill Wolverine. And what I mean by that is in Marvel Comics, and I have some videos covering this, the Xavier protocols basically covered how to successfully kill Wolverine in the main Marvel Universe, and that you have to cut off his head and separate it from his body because Wolverine cannot regrow limbs. He's not like Deadpool. He can't regrow limbs. All you have to do is reattach the limbs, and then the body's healing process will just take care of itself after that. In the Ultimate Universe, that's not the case. That Wolverine's mind, his brain, just continues functioning. It just keeps on keeping on. He's able to talk and all that kind of good stuff. Now, of course, we have to go through a little bit of suspension of disbelief because we know that by way of the human body's natural structure, if the head were severed from the body, it'd be impossible for it to talk, just because of the fact that the human body needs oxygen in order to speak. You have to inhale and exhale in order to successfully make any kind of a noise, not to mention you have your voice box, your larynx and all that kind of good stuff. There's a million different factors as to why this is impossible, but it is a comic book, so we just kind of have to go with it and take it for what it is. But Nick Fury bringing the head of Wolverine here is to basically say, hey, look, we have you in pieces everywhere. Now we can put you back together, but the only way we're going to do that is if you tell us what it was that the Incredible Hulk said. And so what we learn is that following the arrival of She-Hulk, with Wolverine's half his body just kind of being there, and being stuck here, that She-Hulk and and Bruce Banner began to fight one another. Now, the funny thing about this is that Logan also makes the case that maybe the two of them were kind of going at it. Maybe they were banging. He doesn't really know. He wasn't really paying attention. But she and he had both said something to one another, but no one knows what it was that they said except for She-Hulk saying, "I still love you." And so because of that, it seems like he doesn't really reveal to Nick Fury what it was that was said, but Nick Fury effectively gives him back the rest of his body and the fact that he's able to heal himself. The kicker with this is that with his hands being encased, he's not able to pop his claws, which means he can engineer his escape. But the funny thing about this is he's suddenly met with the arrival of Forge. Now, in Marvel Comics, in the main Marvel universe, Forge is, one of the main members of the X-Men. He helps them out with different missions, so on and so forth. He's been really one of the major supporting characters and was actually the leader of X-Factor for a time prior to Valerie Cooper taking over. I may be incorrect about that. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was Valerie Cooper who took over X-Factor from Forge. But the idea here is that Forge, again, is just kind of like a genius inventor, and he's very much like that here in the Ultimate Universe. And he says, of course, he created a tuning fork that allows him to phase through objects, and so this tuning fork is effectively used by Wolverine to phase out of his own confinements. And so from here, we end up traveling back with him as he's making his way to where Jennifer Walters is located, and it's really kind of this all things coming together, the story effectively coming to its conclusion in the sense that he begins to sort of taunt She-Hulk a little bit, taunt Betty Ross, and then of course she transforms into her She-Hulk form and the two of them start, fighting for a little while. But the idea here is that, again, he's still trying to find Bruce Banner. And so what he does is he sits down, or at least when she's attacking him, he basically pops two of his claws and says two of these claws are in a couple of organs that you can survive from. The first one's in your spleen, you'll bleed out, but you'll live. The second one is in your kidney, but you've got a second one, so that's fine. But he says the third one is gonna go through your liver, and the liver is what filters toxins from your body. And if your liver is damaged, you will die. And so he says, I'm gonna go find Bruce Banner. I'm gonna go find him and I'm gonna kill him. But if you warn him, if you tell him that I'm coming, I'll come back and I will kill you. And so because of that, She-Hulk knows enough about Wolverine to basically leave him alone. Now, the funny thing about this is that Betty Ross tells him, look, don't do this. I love him. But in truth, Wolverine's like, sorry about your luck. And the reason why is because when he looks at her as a character, he says, look, you broke the guy's heart. You bailed out on him when he needed you most. You can't come back now and say, well, no, I want you to keep him alive. You've made your choices and you've got to live with the choices that you've made. And so because of this, he basically leaves her behind and says, all of this is effectively on your head. And so from here, we actually pick up with Atlantic Air, with Bruce Banner trying to make his escape. Now, of course, with these inhibitor collars that were created for the purpose of confining people's powers, this is immediately attached to Bruce Banner in order to keep him from, at least it seems like keeping him from being able to use his powers. Now, this is really kind of a cool discussion between Wolverine and Banner because, Wolverine intends to kill him. He intends to get rid of him. But as the two of them are talking, Wolverine also says, look, I'm not going to do this here because if you decide to freak out, if you decide to lose your mind, you'll kill all these innocent people, hence the inhibitor collar, hence the reason why I put this on you. More so than that though, Banner basically starts to make the case that, hey, look, I'm trying to turn over a new leaf. I'm trying to be a good guy. I'm in control of myself now. The Hulk doesn't come out unless I want him to come out. Now, initially on the surface, it seems like he's kind of begging. It seems like he's kind of making nonsense and it seems like he's lying. But what he does is he actually runs for one of the exits on the plane and jumps to his death. And so when Wolverine follows him, he says, look, turn into the Incredible Hulk, change into the Incredible Hulk. And Banner keeps saying no. Banner keeps saying, no, I'm not going to turn into the Hulk. And so it seems like this collar doesn't really inhibit his powers per se, so much as it keeps this whole situation, or at least it has some kind of psychological effect, more or less. But the idea here is that, ultimately, right before they hit the ground, Banner turns into the Incredible Hulk once this collar is released. And so because of this, the two of them are basically met with the arrival of Nick Fury, who had followed Wolverine here. And what he says is, we engineered Wolverine's escape. We allowed him to leave. We had Forge go to meet him and then set him up to leave so we could follow him because Wolverine is basically unintelligent. He essentially says Wolverine's dumb, that he allows his instincts to take over. He doesn't pay attention to the bigger picture, that he thinks about one target and that's all he focuses on. And so because of this, he says, look, here's what's gonna happen. We have Betty Ross. It's the one person in the world that you care about no matter what you say. We have Betty Ross held prisoner. And so Nick Fury says, you are going to come to work for me eventually. That's going to happen. It may not be right now. It may not be tomorrow. It will be somewhere along the line. If you choose not to, that's on you. But know that whatever happens to Betty Ross is because of you. And so it's really just kind of tugging on his heartstrings. It's really just kind of, grabbing Bruce Banner and pulling on his strings in order to get him to work alongside S.H.I.E.L.D. But this story effectively ends up wrapping up. But again, what this does is it kind of creates these small little self-contained stories because this is really what the Ultimate Universe is. The Ultimate Universe does have an ongoing timeline, and there were a series of events that all happened that led up to Ultimatum and beyond, but a lot of these were just relatively small, niche confined stories that were easily digestible, easily read, and allowed people to pick and choose what it is that they wanted while still understanding everything that was going on and how the Ultimate Universe functioned as a whole. But if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you hit the subscribe button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.